Okay, so part two. This one is specific to more to environment texturing, because what we're going to do is we're just going to make a tiling texture in ZBrush. We are not going to draw it. We are going to sculpt it. So ZBrush has some really cool functionality in terms of helping you with making tiling things and just making some really cool shapes. So what we're going to start with is this is two planes that I made in a modeling program. You can use like 3ds, Maya, Blender, whatever you like. But I'm starting with a 1 meter by 1 meter plane and then a 2 meter by 2 meter plane. The 1 meter by 1 meter plane we're going to use in marmoset later for baking, but the 2 meter one is what we're going to sculpt on. So right off the bat, like I showed in the previous video, basic geometry is not good for sculpting because it's low res and essentially every polygon is a pixel in sculpture terms. So what we need to do is we need to up-res it, increase the resolution so that we can start sculpting. By default, ZBrush has it's a subdivision tool, and what this does is it divides the existing geometry in half. But what that does is it also smooths the edges, much like Smooth in Maya or Turbo Smooth in 3ds Max. So what we need to do is turn off SMT, which is short for smooth, and should be labeled better. And then Control D to divide, also available here to click. And what we're seeing here is we're starting to add subdivisions that we can switch through. So I'm going to divide 5 times, turn off, and I'm going to start to see that there's the resolution I need. I'm going to give it one more time. That seems like a good place to start. But this doesn't help me really, because what I'm seeing here is I'm sculpting on a plane, and if I were to go off the plane, I would not continue over here. So I would be I would not be making a tiling texture that I could use later on for texture. But what ZBrush has is under the brush menu and under the if we go down to curve, there's this fun thing called wrap mode. And what wrap mode does is it takes the local space of the object and says where does it stop and where does it begin in local space, and when you jump off the model, it picks up on the other side. What we have here is this will tile with itself, and that's really cool. But what we need to do, because we're going to bake onto a plane that is half the size, is we're going to go up to wrap mode 2. And what this does is it starts to tile all over the place, which is really neat because we have this, just by doing this, we have this fun, noisy spiraling texture that will give us height information to bake later, and it tiles perfectly in all 4 directions, and it's the size of this plane. So let's have some fun with it. So I'm going to make a rock texture just to show you how that might go. So I'm going to say that this is like a cliff wall. So I'm going to add some striations. Start with some base striations of like how the rocks might be built up and where they might be in space. Or maybe not a cliff face. I'll call this a cobblestone path. Yeah. So I'm just gonna be adding cobblestones. And sure enough, it tiles all over the place. So I can put down a rock anywhere, and 2 steps over, it adds another one. So right off the bat, we have something that kind of looks like it could work. So from here, we're going to go back to, as I showed in the last video, Dynamesh. And Dynamesh has some really cool features over here. So what Groups does is sometimes you if you set up different objects and you need to keep them separate, you can turn on Groups. But what we're going to work with is Polish. And what Polish does is it utilizes the clay polish tool as part of Dynamesh. So every time you add geometry, it adds a pinch to any hard edges. So what we have here is something that is kind of lumpy, kind of nasty. But if we click clay polish, what it does is it creases the edges based on these parameters. So if we turn up sharp to a significant amount, what we get is really sharp edges. And we start to get something a little more stylized. Stylization is cool and it has its place, but it's also a very good place to start with when you're going for realism. because with these sharp edges, I'm preserving my large shapes so that I can make blockouts, I can make large decisions, and keep them crisp before I go back and beat them up and detail them and add small noise. So I always want to start with this really simple stylization. This is evident in most art, across most art forms. One of the really famous things is the Asaro head, and what this is it's this guy, I don't know his actual name, but something Asaro, I would assume, came up with a simplification of the human face that breaks it down into the really important plane changes of where the face's planes change and start going in different directions. And instead of this smooth skull, what you're getting is the head goes in this direction, stops, goes in this direction, goes in this direction, goes in this direction. You can always smooth at the end, and that's what you start to see in some parts of this head, is that some are crisper than others. Others are starting to smooth out. What this is telling us is that we need to start with this really low and simple forms to establish our detail, or to establish what we're making, and then afterwards smooth it out and start to add detail, because then we'll have this strong foundation, and the detail is simply added on top. All right, so by turning on polish, we'll smooth this out. Oh yeah, so note that right there, what I did, the smooth did not transfer over, because each brush individually needs to be set up to the tile. So under smooth, while I'm holding down Shift, I go into brush, wrap mode 2, and now that will tile as well. So we're back into this muddy nonsense with the geometry that's not quite useful for sculpting. But when we turn on Dynamesh with polish, it fixes the geometry and then also adds this polish. What's happening over here is that Dynamesh doesn't really like thin forms, so that actually could be a problem with it. Let's see. Okay. Instead of Dynamesh, I'm going to stick with just hard geometry. So clay polish, and subdivisions. I'm going to upres again, and I'm going to hit clay polish. And I'm just going to sculpt some large cobblestone shapes. Smoothing as I go, and after I've smoothed, I'm going to clay polish. And it's going to help me establish these forms. These forms are big rocks. So what's really helpful about having this plane be larger than the one we're going to bake on is we can start to see how this is going to look when it tiles. So something really important about tiling textures is that you don't have landmark details. So if I have a big rock, it's going to show up every step of the way. So what this starts to show you is that this is going to look like a grid. So we need to be careful with, like, this little lump here is kind of distinctive, a distinctive pattern. It's going to show up on a grid, so we just need to flatten them back out. Oops. Again, that one didn't tile. Brush, wrap mode 2. This is my H polish. H polish is better than polish. There is a polish brush available. If you click here, you can find PO for polish. I don't know what the difference is, but BH, which gives you H polish, is just a better brush. Feels better to use. I'm just gonna go through. I'm gonna clean up these forms and try to unify everything, so that if you zoom out, you start to lose where the edge stops and where the next tile of the texture begins. And again, just keep doing clay polish. Back to PCB. Start adding some small detail. So like little pebbles, less severe shapes. And really, you can sculpt anywhere. Any other program, doesn't have to be ZBrush. I don't know if they all have this wrap mode setting, which is why I'm using ZBrush right now. But the idea of sculpting textures still stands, and I'll show you what that means when this becomes a texture later down the line. Then a little bit of detail, clay polish, and we start to see these start to take the form of rocks. Flesh out the detail. And start big, work your way down, slowly get smaller. Smaller, more precise, higher resolution. Always start big, low res, so they can make your very important decisions with lots of room to work. I'm starting to like this, and I feel like I'm getting to a point where I can switch over to alphas and very small detail. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to up res again, so to get up from 7 to 8. And, one last clay polish. You get really crisp edges. And I'm going to stop adding new sculpture detail. And I'm just going to work on flattening and defining. And switch over to BST for standard. Turn on wrap mode. And let's play some alphas. So again, like these little dots, where they were like rust or something else in the last video. Now you can use them as say some little pebbles in the details, or dirt. What we're seeing here is that stuff is starting to stretch because as clay polish works, it pinches and hardens things. So we might actually need to reset the geometry before we can go any further. So what we need to do is go to ZRemesher. Diamesh is great for solid objects, but what it does is it closes off transparent back faces, so make sure everything's watertight. ZRemesher works only with what's available. So ZRemesher is also similar to Dynamesh, but it preserves creases better. It doesn't give you the same grid space, so it's a bit harder to sculpt on, and it's better for finalizing, but it's great for the final pass end detail. So we're just gonna leave it at its default settings. What we see down here is like target poly count, and that's useful once you get down to the nitty-gritty of retopologizing. But right now we're working only in high poly, so we're just going to use the same number of polygons that's already in the model. This will take a second. Let this load up. It's reading the entire mesh and projecting the same kind of grid, but with more detail preservation. All right, so what we see here is that some of that fun detail that we added has been lost, but now what we have is an entirely new bit of geometry, and everything is a bit more normalized. All the polygons are relatively the same size. They're not as perfectly the same size as they are in Dynamesh, but what this does is it preserves the detail and starts to add polygon flow so that the creases are better preserved. So from here we can go back and we can Control D or divide to add divisions again. And at this point we can turn smooth on because we're high poly enough that smoothing isn't going to destroy the hard edges on the outside. So we're going to go back in with our standard brush, and we're going to add some of that noise into the recesses. Bumpy noise, I like to add it in deep recesses. I don't generally like to add it to large flat surfaces because you need to balance your areas of detail and rest. So you need to preserve things like large flat spaces so that the eye can look throughout your texture and find spaces to look and places that are more grounding. Whereas in the crevices that the eye skips over, you can add this interesting detail that sells the viewer on realism without confusing them, so that they can understand what they're looking at, and also in the periphery pick up bits of detail. That's just generally something that's important in modeling, is that when you're adding grime, be really specific about where you're adding it, because if it's everywhere, it's not going to look real. But if it's nowhere, it's also not going to look real. So you need to do a lot of research and a lot of time, like looking at things in your life. Like look at the trash can on the street. Look at your car. Look at your laptop and see where the detail, like the organic detail, tends to accumulate. So like if you think of a trash can, the detail tends to be in the crevices, where the manufactured large plastic sides of the trash can, large metal sides, are these big flat spaces where maybe there's some runny detail or like some grime running down the side of them, but for the most part, any particulate detail is going to be jammed into the crevices, and that's just something to think about. I'm going to switch between alphas and some more interesting ones. A lot of people use ZBrush, so it tends to stand out when you use only one alpha, because everybody's like, "Ooh, he's using ZBrush." I recognize that alpha, and it's kind of something you want to avoid. So just use a bunch. Always be smoothing, always be coming back and playing with different forms of detail. So mix and match. Play with different sizes. That's the whole point of drawing rectangle, is that not every bit of detail and not every alpha is being applied at the same size, because you're dragging to a different dimension every time. Okay. Just a little more detail, and then I'll get into how to bake something like this. So right here, what I'm doing is I'm breaking up this flat space, but I'm also taking the smooth brush and I'm smoothing back, so that the detail starts at the edge, and as it gets to the center, like it would in the real rock, as it gets to the sturdier, more solid parts, it smooths out and becomes a flat space again, where the eye can rest. We can always go back to clay polish if we want to tighten things up. Now that we're really high res, clay polish is less effective, but what it does is it just tightens things up. Make sure that your detail isn't muddy. We can turn down sharpness so we're not losing so much detail too. And then just go back with a little more after we've simplified. And really be specific about where the high-res detail is. And for stylization purposes, you can stop at any point during this process and say, this is as far as I want to take it towards realism. You could go on infinitely, add more small detail, and get to more levels of resolution, and just ever-increasing molecular levels of detail. But you can also stop at any point and say, this is where I need to stop. This is as much detail as I want to add. Even here, I might simplify and flatten some things out so that we're not too noisy. Because we want it readable, and we want the audience to know exactly what they're looking at a glance. But we also need to convince them that it's of what material we're trying to sell. Let's see. We can also use stuff like mallet fast is fun for organic textures like this. The one I showed in the crate demo, just to beat up the rock edges a little bit. Again, brush, turn on round mode. Just start to add some damage, really specific damage. So what I'm doing here is I'm not interfering with the clean spaces. I'm working the edges and changing the silhouette slightly. So the silhouette, as it gets more beat up, it becomes true to life and truer to and easier to understand this material I'm trying to sell. What I have here, I have a rock texture, tiles in 4 directions, and I think I'm happy with where it's at. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to export this as a OBJ. And what it's going to spit out is this is a flat plane. So back in the arm set, what we have here is the base plane that I started sculpting on, with the small plane and the large plane. What I'm going to do is I'm going to delete the large plane. So I just have this little one. And I'm going to drag in the high poly. Now what we see is that it is larger than the low poly, but because we used that border thing, the border of the repeated asset stops and starts at the same place as the smaller plane. And that just gives gives us more control when we're sculpting, so we can make decisions right at the edges rather than have to worry about when you ZBrush and when you Dynamesh, stuff tends to get creased inwards. So we have just some bleeding on. So we're going to set up a baker and put the base plane in the low poly and this high poly in the high poly. And when we're setting up the cage, we're going to turn the max offset all the way up so that the cage floats above the high poly. I'm going to go into the baker, set this up, and bakes. 2K is fine. Normal map, curvature, and inclusion. This other stuff you can really bake anything with this method. So you could sculpt out a flat brick street or not sculpt out, but model out like sci-fi panels in Maya or 3ds Max. You could sculpt wood planks. You could model wood planks and anything like that. But as long as you start with this plane and extrude the offset cage above this flat tiling plane, you'll be able to use this as a texture. I'll show you what I mean. So set this offset. Make sure it in no way intersects with the tiling high poly. Back to your baker, as usual. Sample 16, soften 0.5, padding extreme, resolution 2K is fine for this, and then bake. Alright, bake's done. I had the high poly, and I'm going to show you how this turned out. Low poly, material, set the albedo, on that, to boom. We have a plane with a flat texture baked from a tiling high poly. So we can test this in arm set by changing the tiling and see that, yeah, this does tile infinitely because we sculpted it with wrap mode on. So that's really cool. And again, you can do this with anything. Like if you make it in Max, you make a 1x1 plane, you cut in some cut lines for like concrete sidewalk tiles. Just drop it in an marmoset with a 1x1 plane, move the offset above whatever you're baking from, and you can have a nice little texture. Albedo, let's check out that maybe inclusion. Use that to RGB. Yeah, look at that. That starts to look like something usable. curvature. All right. Y'all got any questions? Okay, let's call it.